Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a completely fascinating thought experiment. We're unpacking a brilliant creative dialogue that reimagines Albert Camus' classic novel, The Stranger. In this source text, Camus himself basically moderates a debate between his own characters to answer a deeply unsettling question. What if remaining neutral actually makes you responsible for another person's suffering? We're going to see if a man's simple refusal to play by society's emotional rules was in fact his true crime. Here is the docket for our philosophical debate today. The crime of honesty, the convenient villain, the extra shots, meaning without God, and who is the stranger. We'll be tracking Meursault's journey from a quiet funeral to a blinding beach and finally straight into a prison cell. Starting with part 1, the crime of honesty, emotion versus performance. We actually begin not with the murder itself, but with the funeral of Meursault's mother, an event that becomes the absolute foundation for how society ends up judging him. I want you to act as the jury for a second and really consider this. Must a person actively display emotion in order for that emotion to be considered real? The text challenges us to ask if forced fake tears in front of a mirror would have somehow made Meursault a better son or just a better actor. Instead of weeping, he drank coffee, he smoked, he watched the weather. He literally just didn't perform the rituals of grief that society expects of us. The prosecutor is just relentless on this point. He basically demands performative grief, arguing that tears are the necessary evidence you need to prove a person's humanity and trustworthiness. To the prosecutor, if you can't mourn in a way that society easily recognizes, how can society possibly trust you to follow any of its other rules? And right there, that hits the nail on the head. That is the core friction of this entire story. Meursault's radical sincerity means he completely refuses to wear the mask society hands him. He tells the room that his mother was already dead, and there was nothing he could do for her. It's not that he hates her, he just absolutely refuses to translate his internal state into an external performance, just to make everyone else feel comfortable. Moving into part 2, the convenient villain. Let's head into the courtroom and see how this all builds into an indictment not just of a physical crime, but of a man's entire character. When the prosecutor stacks up this specific sequence of events, it visually piles up the evidence, creating a narrative that makes Meursault look completely morally bankrupt. By intentionally starting with the mother's funeral rather than the actual fight on the beach, the prosecutor is weaving a very specific story for the jury, one that paints Meursault as a total monster long before he ever picked up a weapon. So here's the crucial takeaway. There were essentially 2 trials happening simultaneously in that room. One for pulling the trigger on the beach, and a second one for failing to perform the expected rituals of civilization. And, as the source text points out, it was really that second trial, the trial of his character, judging whether he loved and mourned correctly, that ultimately decided his fate. Think about Raymond for a second. This is a guy who physically beats women, manipulates people, and is actually the one who brought the gun to the beach. Yet he is somehow less disturbing to the court than Meursault. Why? Because Raymond's ugly, vengeful motives make sense to them. Society totally understands greed and revenge. But Meursault? He just admits things without defending himself. He doesn't beg to be understood. And honestly, that just terrifies people. Part 3. The 4 extra shots. Now we leave this stifling courtroom and head out to that blinding white sand of the beach, where all logical explanations just start to melt away. It sounds crazy, but can the sun force a man to pull a trigger? Meursault doesn't describe that first shot as some calculated, premeditated murder. He describes it as a physical reflex driven by this oppressive heat, the blinding glare, and the sudden flash of a knife drawn by the victim. In that fraction of a second, the intense light narrowed everything down and effectively erased all moral choice. There was no past, no future, just the unbearable heat and the gun in his hand. But then, after that first fatal shot, there's this deafening silence on the beach. The man is down, and then Meursault inexplicably fires 4 more bullets right into the motionless body. What's so fascinating here is how those extra shots represent a total, irreversible break in his life. The first shot might be explained away by panic or the blinding glare, but the next 4? Those are an act of senseless violence that absolutely defies reason. They're the bullets that kill any chance of Meursault ever going back to an ordinary life. He fired into the silence, and he simply cannot give society a neat, packaged motive for why he did it. Which brings us to part 4, meaning without God. We transition from that wide-open, blinding beach to a tiny, dark prison cell where Meursault faces his impending execution and a very persistent prison chaplain. The chaplain aggressively pushes Meursault to seek forgiveness and eternal hope, asking a massive question: can morality exist without God? He just cannot fathom a man facing death without searching for a miracle or some afterlife. He's essentially demanding that a life must possess an eternal explanation from a higher power to mean anything at all, and he wants Meursault to conform to that religious performance. You can really see the collision of two completely different worldviews here. The chaplain has this desperate need for cosmic meaning, which slams right into Meursault's explosive realization. Meursault totally rejects the chaplain's eternity, because he figures out that the present moment is what actually holds real value. A boring Sunday, a hot bus ride, a simple meal. He suddenly realizes he would gladly take any of those ordinary hours back. He doesn't need the universe to care about him to find value in simply being alive. And that brings us to our final section: who is the stranger? The narrative turns the mirror back around, bringing all these characters together to ask who the true stranger in this story really is. Look at how everyone tried to box Meursault in based on their own expectations. Marie wanted him to vocalize emotional need. The prosecutor demanded a shared moral duty. The chaplain demanded faith. Raymond wanted familiar, selfish motives. Because Meursault flat out refused to conform to any of these labels, they all viewed him as a stranger. They couldn't read him, so they judged him. But then Marie drops a bombshell observation. She powerfully points out that the true stranger was actually the nameless Arab victim. He was entirely erased by the court, by society, and honestly, even by the readers. He was reduced to a mere prop, just an object used to facilitate everyone else's philosophical and legal arguments. This is absolutely the ultimate warning of the text. Camus is telling us that evil doesn't always kick off with overt, screaming hatred. A lot of times, it just begins with passivity. It begins with comfortable silence, and it begins when we reduce living, breathing human beings to mere symbols or headlines. Strangeness begins whenever we fail to step into another person's reality. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to ask yourself, what small, totally unnoticed agreements are you making today? When you stay silent, when you let a convenient label replace a real person, does your refusal to choose actually make you responsible? The most important decisions in life usually arrive quietly, asking only if you will just go along with it and say yes. This whole exploration forces us to take a hard look at our own quiet choices and judgments. To dive even deeper and to read in full, please visit https:/imaginarytalks.com/Albert Camus The Stranger Explained Through Its Characters. It is a brilliant journey and absolutely well worth your time. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the narratives around you.